Never let a good crisis go to waste. What a change. Just 90 or so days ago, back in December, post-election, we had a clear 80-seat majority for a Conservative government. Conservative, surely synonymous with fiscal responsibility. The sunny uplands, a golden honeymoon of decisive leadership after, frankly, we've all been thoroughly fed up with argument and rows over Brexit. The clarity and purpose in levelling up and getting the job done. Well, Rishi tried that spin yesterday, didn't he? But slick as he was, I'm not sure we all completely bought it. And I'm minded to think of the words of Harold Macmillan, Supermac, the Prime Minister between 1957 and 1963. He's the guy that had that wonderful turn of phrase on taking office, "You've never had it so good." But as a jaded man at the end of his term in office, he was interviewed by a cub reporter who asked him the question, "What is it, Sir Harold, what is it that dictates the shape of government? What are the great nuggets that you can provide?" His response was simple as he stared glassy-eyed into the distance. "Events, my dear boy, events." And those events have not just been coronavirus. We have seen the firing of a chancellor, one of the great offices of state, before the man even had an opportunity to deliver a budget. His crime? Fiscal responsibility. We've seen the apparently grotesque bullying by a Home Secretary, another great office of state, all 5'6" of her, for pushing the civil service to serve. A question mark over another of the great offices of state. We've seen a Prime Minister apparently tin-eared over flooding in the north of England. We've seen a rebellion over the proposed sale of critical 5G infrastructure to the apparatus of the world's most authoritarian country. Each of these events in their own right would have been one of Supermac's events. But put them together and add a global pandemic and you have an exceptional stage for a budget. So, events. I saw three things yesterday. Rishi had to do something about the pandemic, and this came in the shape of a fairly clear and cross-party supported £30 billion. Secondly, we learned a lot about politics and the power dynamics in this administration. I thought it was a really competent performance by a young Chancellor who clearly has prime ministerial aspirations. I think based on timescale alone, he's been in the job for a matter of days. There's no way that he can have had any meaningful involvement in preparing his statement. But with his sharp suit and his competent delivery, there was something of a young David Cameron to him. Thirdly, like all good politicians, he has used a crisis as an opportunity and has done his boss's bidding to provide a complete U-turn on so-called austerity. A U-turn that Sajid could not live with, and a Tory spending splurge that would make Jeremy Corbyn blush. The national debt stands at something like £1.8 trillion. That's 86% of GDP. If you read the Tory manifesto, remember this is only a matter of 90 or so days ago, it said that the national debt would be lower at the end of the term of Parliament than at the beginning. And I just don't see how we can square that with this spending splurge. Rishi's speech certainly was silent on that yesterday. He said he was going to make up his own mind, and I think that is the big gamble with this budget. I was looking at some of the spending pledges. £200 million for life sciences, £300 million for clean air, £900 million for nuclear fusion, space and electric cars, £1 billion for green energy, £5 billion for business loans, £110 billion for capital budgets for infrastructure over 5 years. Small government and spending restraint has gone. Margaret Thatcher has gone. This is the biggest giveaway since the days of Norman Lamont in the early 90s. I think this government has done a new Labour. It's done a rebranding, and the Tories Whilst they've been in power for 10 years, you could be forgiven for believing we had a new administration yesterday. That's pretty clever. That's pretty slick to present that to the world. But to be fair, playing devil's advocate, the politic is pretty clear. If you were ever going to be fiscally irresponsible, then the time to do it is at a time of crisis. I think because of coronavirus is something that will come to define the next 5 years when it comes to political accountability. Now, because I'm an accountant, I looked at how the numbers break down, and there's a wonderful statement that we accountants used to use back in the day, and some people might still remember, called the source and application of funds. Something like a cross between a balance sheet and a cash flow statement. What are we doing with our money, and where has it come from? Now, the bottom of that statement, I haven't included all of the infrastructure returns, largely because the OBR is not very accurate at predicting what those returns will be, and largely because the country isn't making much of a return at the moment. The ONS has said that the economy flatlined in January. That's before coronavirus. That's before the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. So I've simplified the bottom half of this source and application of funds to simply debt. And lo and behold, yesterday, 7 a.m., the very morning when such debt was required to balance the books by the Chancellor, the Bank of England cut the cost of debt by 66%. Base rates came down to 0.25%, the first unscheduled cut in 12 years. Now, timescales are really relevant in historical events and budgets. How and when will impacts be felt? Let's first of all consider the very instant reaction to the coronavirus outbreak. This clip wonderfully demonstrates the irrationality of markets and the instant response. It went viral this week. It was a shop in Australia and a fight about toilet roll. I can't get my head around the toilet roll thing, but it does help tell us something about stock markets and how they work. Stock markets continue to be about supply and demand. They continue to be based entirely on sentiment, and they continue, therefore, to be entirely irrational. This morning, we've seen that markets have gone down on average something like 25% across the world. If you want proof, then look at somebody who is widely regarded as the world's most successful stock market investor. Warren Buffett has built his wealth, his capital gains, on getting greedy when everyone else is fearful, and fearful when everyone else is greedy. So we can't take much from the immediate, instant term. What about the 2-month term? Well, this is where competence and science has come in. It's interesting, isn't it, that Boris Johnson has presented with the 2 scientific officers on either side of him in the last few days. And it's interesting how so much in the natural world takes the form of this binomial function or Gaussian probability curve. The same is true of disease and pandemics. Now, the 2-month solution term of the government has been to try and contain and relieve pressure on the NHS. Wash your hands for as long as it takes to sing the national anthem. That's an acknowledgement that we're all going to be exposed to this virus. But what this chart means in scientific terms is if we can flatten out the Gaussian curve, then our health service won't be overwhelmed all at the same point in time, and the pandemic becomes manageable. The area underneath the curve is the same, but one is flatter and one is taller. That's what the government's been doing in the last few weeks. And we've done that in this country by way of public announcements, these wash your hands announcements. The first time we've had this sort of psychology really since the Second World War. China, by contrast, had a more authoritarian approach. Men in white suits rounding people up and putting them into quarantine. The data's coming in now from China, though, and we have a timeline of events on this slide of the events in Hubei province. And you can see the Gaussian curves on this slide. The first one is by date of onset, and the second is by date of diagnosis of the coronavirus. Now, the main point on this slide is the spread on the x-axis, about 1 month from start to finish. in the Chinese example. And the way I've looked at this on the back of an envelope, in simple terms, is we're talking about 1 month of production for the people who will be out of the workforce, which people are estimating at 20%. So my maths is 20% times 1 month times 2 trillion, which is the GDP of the UK. If you do that sum, it gives you £30 billion. So that's pretty easy. So looking at the short term, that's where the rational planning of yesterday's £30 billion fiscal response comes from. The monetary response, what the Bank of England did, dropping interest rates by 50 basis points, really doesn't have any meaningful effect. It was a convenience for Rishi's sums. It was a measure we were expecting anyway, given what the Federal Reserve has done in the US. And actually, what the Bank of England said about easing bank lending and easing those balance sheet restrictions banks have on lending is probably going to be more effective than a drop of 50 points. But you can see how these points make a convenient bridge across that pandemic curve. And you can think, well, if it's a month's impact, then how that spreads over 2 years is probably the kind of timescales that we are going to be talking about. Let's look at 20 years, the medium term, as I've called it. 2020 feels like a natural time to look back 10 years and to look ahead 10 years. What's going to define the 2010s and what is the outlook for the 2020s? If we look at the key trends of the last decade, the sorts of things we saw were globalization becoming the norm, the influence of these big American tech companies, the FANGs as they're called, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. And it's been against the backdrop, the shadow of the 2008 crash, an anemic growth since then, and the recurrent threat of terrorism and a change of the East-West dynamic that we've sort of defined the 2010s. And that's why we've had the emergence of national populist strongmen leaders. We're thinking of people like Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping in China, Erdogan in Turkey. These situations have led to voters starting to think about globalization and whether globalization is good or not. We're all used to globalization, aren't we? We've become used to just-in-time supply chains. We've become used to putting an order in on Amazon and getting the stuff delivered from China in the matter of days. And I think against this backdrop, I think Trump is going to win the next election later this year. And I think you're going to see the consolidation of nationalist politicians around the world. And the reason for this is going back to that financial crisis and going back to the crash and the fact that the political status quo at the time ran out of capital in dealing with it. Voters are fed up with it, and they're attracted to the idea of protectionism, restrictions on immigration, and domestic stimulus. Now, in coronavirus, with the whole of Italy closing down just a few days ago, and the same thing threatened here, possibly in the next fortnight, this accelerates that anti-globalization sentiment a whole lot. I don't think Rishi has factored in these things into his medium term. I think these things will define the early 2020s, but they are out of his hands and they are out of our hands. That's another aspect of the gamble of this budget. It's pretty perilous. So I think taxes will have to rise. And I think when we're back here later in the year, that might be something that we are talking about. Now, economics is the dismal science. But I do think that recession is inevitable. And it's something I've talked about before. Again, if you look back in history, the early 80s, you had Geoffrey Howe, who was Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, and the pursuit of monetarism. Nigel Lawson's boom and bust in 1990-92. The dot-com boom in the early noughties. The financial crash in 2008. If you look over that period of time, on average, every 12 years, we have a recession. 2008 plus 12 equals 2020. Economies are nothing if not cyclical. On top of that, we have coronavirus. On top of that, we have the Brexit issues. So whilst I don't want to be so negative, I can't see any way out of this. And on Greta Thunberg, well, the interesting thing about her is that she represents a demographic which will really come to fore towards the end of the decade. So whilst right now, I might be talking about national strongmen and a sense of populist conservatism, that might not always be the case. Issues such as climate change and a sense that capitalism is not always the right answer is popular amongst this demographic, as we've seen from the Extinction Rebellion protests. So I'm thinking perhaps there is some method in the Tories' reinvention of itself. Very quickly on bond markets. Bond markets are far more interesting than equity markets because they show you where the money really is. They tell a more accurate corona story because bond markets have shown investors selling oil, ditching shares and buying bonds, sometimes even at negative returns. Look at this. This is the US bond market chart. It's still the largest economy in the world, and what we're seeing for the first time is the returns going below 1%. Now, when you look at this and you have in mind the level of debt that the Western world is facing, I do have some concerns that when the bond markets return, debt levels will be unaffordable. So I'm trying my best to be positive, but I've mentioned already the weak statistics for growth in this country. And when you add on to that the impact of coronavirus, I was just looking at this yesterday. The economists are saying a pandemic would mean a minus 1.5% impact on GDP. And as I was looking at this slide, this broke on the BBC website, confirming that it is indeed a pandemic. So we are expecting GDP down 1.5% on the background of 0% growth. The Chancellor's done what he has done in this budget in terms of fiscal measures. The Governor of the Bank of England has provided the monetary measures, but has run out of powder, really, in terms of what else he can do. So I think this recession is on its way. But I do want to try and end on a positive note. It's not all doom and gloom, but we have to look over the long term, and we have to look over the last 200 years. Now, if you look back over that period of time, in pre-modern times, 200 years ago, almost half of all children died. Improvements are down to medicine and sanitation, housing and diet, but also germ theory. Ironically, it was only in the 1850s that surgeons and doctors started to wash their hands. And that has some resonance for the issues that we face today. Wherever you draw the poverty line, the data is clear that poverty has decreased globally too. And this is because of industrial developments and productivity. The beginning of this chart, 1820, there was 1 billion people in the world. At the end of this chart, there were 7 billion people in this world. But look, nonetheless, how poverty across the board has fallen off. Finally, the most important slide for me, freedom. This chart shows the rise of democracy across the world and the expansion of political freedom in green. In red, we have those people living in autocratic states. Of that red bit of that graph, 80% of those people are living in one country, China. Now, China has a 1.3 billion population, and the big question for the next generation is, will that population demand and request democracy? I think whether they do or not will be crucial for that long-term question. And I think you can think of this issue not as the coronavirus, but you can think of it almost as the globalization virus. Thank you.